Here we read from the 12th chapter of Job to help our guests understand what we come to in the 12th chapter of Job. You'll remember that in the first chapter, Job is afflicted by Satan. He's a blameless man. He hasn't done anything deserving. He's not being punished by God at all. In chapter 2, his punishment, not his punishment, his sifting of the devil becomes even worse. And then eventually 3 comforters come to explain things to Job from their particular point of view. And they are Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. And they operate under the modus operatus of the doctrine of retribution, where they believe that Job must have committed some kind of awful sin because he is clearly being punished by God, which isn't the case at all. So in each, we call this the first cycle, Eliphaz spoke, and then Job spoke, and then Bildad spoke, and then Job spoke, and then Zophar spoke. And now we come to the beginning of 3 chapters where Job will answer all 3 of his friends in Job chapter 12, verse 14. This morning we're just going to look at chapter 12, which is the first of the 3 chapters dedicated to Job's response, which ends the first cycle and begins as a bridge to the second cycle. So now we look at Job chapter 12, verse 1. Then Job answered and said, "Indeed, because that ye are the people only, wisdom must die with you. But I have understanding as well as you, and am not inferior unto you. Yea, who knoweth not such things? I am as one mocked of his neighbor, who calleth upon God, and he heareth him. The just and the upright is laughed to scorn. He that is ready to fall is as a lamp despised in the opinion of the rich. The tabernacles of robbers do prosper, and they are in safety that provoke God, whom God hath enriched with his hand. Ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the heaven, and they shall tell thee. Or speak to the earth, and it shall show thee, or the fishes of the sea, and they shall declare unto thee. Who is ignorant of all these things, but that the hand of the Lord hath made these, in whose hand is the soul of every living thing, and the breath of all mankind? Doth not the ears discern the words, and the mouth taste meat for itself? Among the ancient is wisdom, and in the length of days is understanding. With him is wisdom and strength. He hath counsel and understanding. Behold, he will break down, and it cannot be built. He shutteth the man up, and he cannot be loosed. Behold, he withholdeth the waters, and they dry up. But when he sendeth them out, they destroy the earth. With him is strength and wisdom. He that is deceived and that deceiveth are his. He causeth the counselors to go as spoiled, and maketh the judges fools. He looseth the collar of kings, and girdeth their loins with a girdle. He leadeth away the princes as a prey, and overthroweth the mighty. He taketh away the speech from the faithful counselors, and taketh away the judgment of the ancient. He poureth contempt upon princes, and maketh the strength of the mighty weak. He discovereth the deep places from their darkness, and bringeth forth the shadow of death to light. He increaseth the people, and destroyeth them. He enlargeth the nations, and bringeth them in again. He taketh away the hearts of them that are the chief over the people of the earth, and maketh them to wander in the wilderness out of the way. They grope in the dark without light, and he maketh them to stagger like a drunken man." The title of our sermon this morning, Job chapter 12, verses 1 to 25. Job answers all 3 friends. This is not just an answer to Zophar, but an answer to all 3 of his friends. A summary of what his 3 friends have said. This is part 1 of 3. Now that all 3 friends of Job have spoken, Job answers the main gist of each of their arguments here. This 3-chapter speech from chapter 12 to chapter 14 closes the first cycle and introduces the second cycle. It is best to split this speech into 2 parts. Job addresses his friends in chapter 12, verses 1 to chapter 12, verse 1 to chapter 13, verse 19, and then Job addresses God in chapter 13, verse 20 through chapter 14, verse 22. If you'd like to follow the bulletin, you're welcome to do that. We put the sermons in the bulletin so you can follow them with great clarity. Ask questions later if you'd like. There are 3 points to our message this morning. Verses 1 to 5, Job refutes his 3 friends. Verses 6 through 11, Job refutes the doctrine of retribution, which is good only happens to people who are being good, and bad always happens to those who are bad. And verses 12 through 25, Job confirms and expands on the nature of God. And now our context for this morning's text. Job here speaks from a very sarcastic point of view throughout these verses. Job tells the truth, but he does so in order to mock the wisdom of his friends. Everything Job says, he speaks with bitter sarcasm, each statement having a dual purpose, to both humiliate the wisdom of his friends and to show he understands God better than they do. The three friends believe that God is knowable and all his works can be explained by the finite mind. Job says the opposite. Job sees God as a being that does as he pleases, and man cannot possibly know the whole reason behind his eternal decrees. We come to our first point, verses 1 through 6. Job refutes his three friends. Verses 1 and 2. Then Job answered and said, Indeed, because that ye are the people only, wisdom must die with you. Job now speaks to all three of his friends, called his miserable comforters. Job begins by commenting on their collective wisdom. The three friends have put themselves forward as purveyors of wisdom, the last of their age. But they have nothing to teach Job, says Job. Now Job speaks the first time here with some contempt, disapproving of their words that have failed to impart wisdom of what he believes to be the true nature of God. Job had previously been disappointed in them, chapter 6, verses 15 to 21. He had also pronounced them disloyal, chapter 6, verse 14, and accused them of being even callous, chapter 6, verses 26 and 27. Now, Job here sarcastically mocks their own self-confidence in their speech. They spoke as if they were the last ones to be the wise, that all wisdom would die with them and the world would be in the dark without them. Job has the impression that their conceitedness, their false confidence and lack of compassion have led them to exalt their own words, which are in error. Job speaks as if to say, you think yourself fit to dictate and give laws to all of mankind, and your own judgment to be the standard by which every man's opinion must be measured and tried, as if nobody else could discern between truth and falsehood except these three friends. Verse 3, Job says, But I have understanding as well as you, and am not inferior unto you. Yea, who knoweth not such things? Job protests that he has as much intelligence as his three friends. In fact, Job says he is not inferior, and even reckons himself superior by virtue of his greater experience, especially the experience that he's just gone through. By understanding here, Job refers to discerning the nature of God by his outworkings in the world. While no man can know the full meaning behind God's dealings with men, Job notes that he can read the methods and meanings of God's providence as well as his three friends. But Job means that he can do so without the arrogance displayed by his three friends. The three friends all believe that by giving basic arguments concerning the nature of God, such as the fact that he is a God of justice, that God punishes evil, and that he rewards good, and that he is infinite in all his doings, which are all true, that by giving those basic teachings of God, it would prove that Job was punished justly. But Job says, who knoweth not such things? As if to say, everyone knows these basic doctrines concerning the nature of God. And no one denies all these doctrines to be true. But because these attributes of God are true, it does not prove the argument that Job is a sinner and that God is currently punishing him for his sins. That's not what's going on. God is involved in a test with the devil. Verses 4 and 5, Job goes on to lament against his friends. I am as one mocked of his neighbor, who calleth upon God, and he heareth him. The just and the upright is laughed to scorn. He that is ready to fall is as a lamp despised in the opinion of the rich. Job here complains that due to their faulty doctrine of retribution, he has become a laughingstock. The friends taught that Job's affliction was a sign that he was being humiliated by God due to some grievous sin, and is therefore fair game to mock until he repents. His three friends did not intend to laugh at Job's calamity, but their advice has made his suffering worse. Therefore, he says that he is mocked. Furthermore, it says he is mocked by his neighbor. A neighbor is one who should support him and one who can pray for God for him. It says here, who calleth upon God and he heareth him. And therefore his friends could pray for Job and receive an answer from God which would be helpful, for God has refused to commune with Job. Job says that he is among the just and the upright who should be pitied, and instead he is laughed to scorn. Now Job uses an example here to explain his sad state. He says he is like as a man standing before his own dug grave, ready to fall in, and therefore he is deserving of pity. He also compares himself to a match that is burning out. He says he is like a lamp or a torch, which is useful when it burns brightly. But when it burns down, it is just a flicker of light, and then it's thrown to the side and despised as not being useful anymore. And so Job says he is like that match that once burned brightly and was useful to many. But when his health and life seem at an end, he is despised and mocked and scorned as worthless in the thoughts of men, who are at ease and prosperous. That's what this verse means when it says, in the opinion of the rich. It is an age-old truth that those in prosperity often look down upon the poor or the sick, as if the rich and wealthy have done something deserving of their prosperity, and the sick and poor have done something worthy of misery. We come to our second point, verses 6 through 11. Job refutes the doctrine of retribution. Verse 6, Job says this, the tabernacles of robbers do prosper. Tabernacles is another word for house. And they are in safety, that provoke God, whom God hath enriched with his hand. Now Job seeks to show what damage the doctrine of retribution has done. His friends have maintained that God always rewards good and always punishes evil. So Job cites his own case as a strong example against such a clear-cut doctrine. Job says that while a godly man like him is being afflicted, the godless sleep safely in their homes, or tabernacles, soundly in their beds. Job here gives words to his confused emotions, as all poetry generally is, and suggests that since God is so distant and aloof as to let him suffer undeservedly, it only stands to reason that he must also not care if the wicked prosper. After all, imagines Job, those who robbed me, the Chaldeans and the Sabaeans, you'll remember from chapter 1, do not suffer as I do, but prosper, and with my possessions. Not only have these wicked men avoided God's wrath, he has prospered or enriched them. Verses 7 through 9. Job says sarcastically, ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the heaven, and they shall tell thee. Or speak to the earth, and it shall show thee. Or the fishes of the sea, and they shall declare unto thee. Who is ignorant of all these, but that the hand of the Lord hath made these? Now Job is at his most sarcastic. His friends have argued earlier that nature itself will teach Job that he is wrong. Natural revelation. But Job turns the table on them and shows that nature clearly supports his position, which is that the world is a wicked place, and for a time the wicked will prosper, and God allows it. And consequently, for a time, the righteous suffer, and God allows it. And now, says Job, I will use your own argument to prove my own. Job says, consider the lesson of nature as it is taught by the ravenous beast, that is, the animals that attack like kinds. The birds and fishes, which are the most ravenous in attack, fare the best. The meek birds, or fowls, and fish live in fear. The birds that steal and kill are the birds that prosper. So says Job, like the Chaldeans and Sabaeans that killed Job's children and stole his possessions, are by nature like the mischievous birds and fish that take without care, and yet they live and prosper. Verse 10 and 11. In whose hand is the soul of every living thing, and the breath of all mankind? Doth not the ears discern the words, and the mouth taste meat for itself? Job here advances his argument. Since it is an obvious truth that both man and animals are under the power of God, then everything good and bad happens according to God's divine arrangement. And if God, by his own design, allows the wicked to prosper, which is clear for all to see, then it stands to reason that the righteous may suffer, and that God allows that too. Nature cannot be said to support that the argument that the righteous always prosper. Next then, Job quotes a proverb. He says, the ear discerns the words, meaning the purpose of the ear is to listen to words and judge them to be true or false. He says, and the mouth tastes meat for itself, meaning the function of the mouth is to determine whether the taste of some food is healthy or rancid. The meaning is just as the mouth and the ear have a responsibility to discriminate and decide what is worth hearing and eating, so his friends must weigh Job's words and decide if they be true or false. Verse 12, Job says, among the ancient is wisdom, and in the length of days is understanding. Bildad, of course, had earlier argued that wisdom is found entirely in ancient wisdom. Job now repeats that idea, but not to agree, but to sarcastically oppose the idea. Wisdom, argues Job, has nothing to do with age. There are as many wrong ideas as wise ideas rooted in history. Also, human wisdom cannot stand up to the wisdom of God or begin to understand it. Job has also been accused of not properly discerning God's working out of his nature in human events. Job has argued that he knows better than his friends the mind of God and his doings. Now Job combines Bildad's advice, which was to consult the ages, the ancients, with the three friends' criticism of Job, which was that Job does not understand the mind of God as well as they do. Job says the wisdom of man is always finite and imperfect and liable to many mistakes. Job will now show his three friends just what he has learned about God from first-hand experience, which gives him greater insight into the mind of God. Job will teach his three friends what ancient wisdom could not. And now we come to our final point, verses 13 through 25. Job confirms and expands on the nature of God. And now an introduction to these 13 verses. Job's purpose in this speech here is to show forth his wisdom of God as opposed to his friends' wisdom, and his understanding of the true nature of God's activity. The speech, however, is bitter. It is not meant to praise God, for Job does not feel like he has anything to praise God for. Nor is this speech an acknowledgement of God's power, for in the mind of Job, God's power has only been used to do him harm. The God that Job expounds on in these verses is an eccentric. He is not concerned with keeping order in the universe. He is certainly not the God of rewarding the righteous and punishing the wicked. His ways, according to Job, often stand aloof to human understanding, and he offers no explanation why this is so. course, all these things that Job is saying is slightly skewed. There's some truth to it, but it's slightly skewed. Job truly believes that God is holy and wise. He believes that God does everything, however, for his own benefit. But Job is gravely disappointed that those who follow God to the greatest degree cannot know his mind, nor are given any explanation to what clearly looks to Job here as unfair. Job has learned from his experience that God is not who Job expected him to be. If he appears aloof or unethical, if at times God appears to be punishing us for something we don't deserve, we are in the wrong, says Job. He is in the right. And this we must accept because God owes us no explanation. There are 3 parts to this speech in verses 13 through 15. Job makes general statements about the wisdom of God, 13 to 15. In 16 to 21, we read of the power of God over leaders and government, and verses 20 through to 25 concern nations as a whole. Verses 13 to 15. With him is wisdom and strength. He has counsel and understanding. Behold, he will break down, and it cannot be built. He shutteth a man up, and he cannot be loosed. Behold, he withholdeth the waters, and they dry up. But when he sendeth them out, they destroy the earth. Here in these verses, Job argues against the claims that the truth about God is what has been traditionally found with the ancients or the aged. Job says, on the contrary, the truth about God is with God alone. God alone is the only one who knows what he is doing. He hath counsel and understanding, says Job. The 3 friends pretend to know the principles on which God acts, such as their doctrine of retribution. Whereas Job knows there are no fixed principles on which God acts, not at any rate that would always appear rational or ethical to man. They certainly are rational and ethical to God, but they don't always appear so to man, says Job. The righteous man may expect that trouble can come at any time, without warning, for no apparent reason to ourselves. In verse 14, Job begins to catalog the divine activities which cannot be understood or explained by man. Job's view of God is colored by his current condition. That's why it sounds so bitter. Each of the activities of God are shown here in scenes that emphasize God acting destructively, negatively, or causing chaos, disturbing the moral order of the universe, at least from man's perspective. If God decides to destroy a kingdom, it says, he will break it down and it cannot be rebuilt. Such as when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, the Tower of Babel, or the walls of Jericho. No one can alter the plan of God. Not only is God the Lord over human history, but over nature, equally. He can take a prosperous land and withhold water, turning it into a desert. Or he can send a flood that destroys all of life, as in the Great Flood. Notice for Job, in this text, there's either not enough water or there's too much water. What God does destructively leaves a bitter taste in the mouth of Job. He sees God is all-powerful, but asks to what end? Job has learned from first-hand experience that God often appears as a destructive force that does as he pleases, and God owes no one an explanation. Verses 16 to 21. With him is strength and wisdom. He that is deceived, and that deceiveth are his. He causeth the counselor to go as spoiled, and maketh the judges fools. He looseth the collar of kings, and girdeth their loins with a girdle. He leadeth away the princes as a prey, and overthroweth the mighty. He taketh away the speech from the faithful counselors, and taketh away the judgment of the ancient. He poureth contempt upon princes, and maketh the strength of the mighty weak. This all has one point to it. These 6 verses focus on God's power or ability to dismantle all parts of the government. Job grimly divides all mankind into 2 classes. He that is deceived, and that deceiveth. For Job, all mankind is either actively deceiving someone or unwittingly being deceived. Job obviously is bitter. His state of mind has clouded all human activity as negative. Here Job feels he's being deceived by his deceitful friends. Governments are generally led by various officers. Here in these verses, Job mentions counselors and judges in verse 17, kings in verse 18, princes and military leaders, here called the mighty, in verse 19, counselors and unofficial advisors, called ancients. All of them, at God's choice, are, in God's timing, humiliatingly deposed. It is the responsibility of this group of leaders to direct a nation. But Job says that in spite of their abilities, God will cause them to fail in their duties and be overtaken by another nation. Job makes no mention whether the nation is more or less evil. God does what he wants, for his own purposes, in his own timing, and needs to offer no explanation. That's what Job has learned that the friends haven't learned. Man cannot know the reasons, but must accept them. We see these leaders here are spoiled, robbed of all their possessions, made foolish, dragged away as prisoners by a conquering nation. Military leaders are overthrown and brought to surrender. The speech of the counselor fails, and the army fights as though weak, without strength. This is the manner in which God deposes nations. Job's point in all this is to show that God is all-powerful. There is no denying his ability to overthrow nations. But the conventional academic theology of his three friends cannot explain it any more than they can truly explain God's purposes in dealing with Job. In the end, we can never really know why God does what he does. We're not Pentecostals who think we know the mind of God. We cannot know ultimately why he does what he does, all of why he does what he does, because we can't see the big picture. We certainly cannot state God's purpose with any certainty, as do Job's friend. Therefore, Job calls them deceivers. I just want you to understand, that's the argument here. His three friends are saying that he can know the mind of God based on the way God is treating Job. And Job's saying that is not true. We cannot entirely know why God does everything. We know he does everything mercifully and justly and holily. But we don't know why he does what he does, when he does it. We don't have a perfect picture of that. So Job's argument is more right. It's just said in bitterness. We come to our final group of verses, verses 22 through 25. He discovereth the deep places from their darkness, and bringeth forth the shadows of death to light. He increaseth the people, and destroyeth them. He enlargeth the nations, and bringeth them in again. He taketh away the hearts of them that are the chief over the people of the earth, and maketh them to wander in the wilderness out of the way. They grope in the dark without light, and he maketh them to stagger like a drunken man. You will remember the point of this whole speech is for Job to demonstrate that it is he that better understands the mind of God than his three friends. Job says, you think you know God because he is a God that moves logically in the mind of man. But Job said, it is I that know the mind of God better, for I know God to move in an orderly way only in his own mind. But to man who knows very little, he appears to be a God of chaos. For no man knows how and why